Hey, what's happening? Robert Phoenix here. Welcome to 15 Minutes of Flame. It is Monday, the 11th of May. 5:11, not quite 4:11, not quite 9:11. 5:11. What's happening? So we come here today to gather once again to stream through events that are happening at a breakneck pace inside of our world. And today I'm going to cover probably about three things, maybe four if I have time. And the first thing I want to talk about is some of you may remember Kevin McMahon. He was a guest on the show when I was over on Blog Talk, probably about, I don't know, maybe 2.5 years ago. Anyway, Kevin has developed a very aggressive form of leukemia and is essentially preparing to exit out of this world. So any of you who heard the interview with Kevin or have been aware of his work, which is just absolutely astounding in terms of synchromysticism. I mean, Kevin is a bona fide genius. I just wanted to pass the news along and share it with you. His attitude is incredibly positive and as about as brave and enlightened as you could ask of anyone who is still young and in the prime of their life and getting ready to transition out of here. And that may not be necessarily a bad thing. I think we have a lot of living to do here. And this is what I wanted to talk about today to some extent, and I'll probably get to that towards the end of the show, because we're going to need a significant paradigm shift inside of ourselves in order to navigate through these times. And it's going to call for things that have never been on the table for us before. And I'll talk about some of that when we get to the sort of the wind down at the end of the show. Speaking of great souls in transition or having transitioned, one of the godfathers of LSD passed away recently. I became aware of this in the last week as I began my stroll down memory lane and started to watch some documentaries that are on Netflix and Amazon, primarily about LSD and the Brotherhood of Eternal Love and Tim Scully and Nick Sand, and of course Owsley. But Owsley in these two documentaries that I watched was a kind of a peripheral character. He was one of the main chemists that really started cooking up LSD, and he transferred his knowledge to Nick Sand and Tim Scully, and then we have the 60s, really. It's the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, Owsley, Sand, and Scully. So Nick Sand was an amazing guy, and he was right there from the beginning. He lived in New York. He traveled to Millbrook. He hung out with Larry and Alpert, became a guide at Millbrook. Millbrook was it was sort of the high church of LSD back in the 60s, and the property was owned by Billy Mellon Hitchcock, part of the Mellon family, and he funded a large share of the LSD explosion in the 1960s. The other part was being funded by the hashish and pot sales of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, who I'll talk about in a minute here. But Nick Sand and Tim Scully were partners in this whole operation. And it's a fascinating time, those mid-60s years, from roughly about 64 to about 68. And 68, everything begins to sort of tilt on its axis. And, whether you like him or not, or trust him or not, of course, we've since discovered that Tim Leary had very strong connections with the CIA, and that LSD was part of a larger program that included MK Ultra and Project Bluebird and a number of other projects where they were essentially, doing kind of a mind wipe on millions and millions of youth in America, which may have not been a bad thing, to be honest with you. But I don't think Nick Sand was in on it. I don't think Nick Sand was somebody who, in fact, I know he wasn't in on it. He was somebody who was consumed by a vision, and that vision was a vision of love. It was a vision of deep, deep, deep connection with deep consciousness, deep awareness, and the dissolve between ourselves and our ego and God. I mean, this is what fueled guys like Nick Sand. Tim Scully, on the other hand, was more of a nerd, more of a geek, more of a kind of a mad scientist and into it because he could probably make some money. He had some philosophical urge to make a difference. He was a Virgo, Sand was a Taurus, but Scully was not captured with that same sort of call, let's put it that way, that Nick Sand had. And Sand kept making LSD all the way up through the late 90s until he was, again, sort of, found out. And after the late 90s, the LSD production and the availability of LSD in the United States dropped off precipitously. Down in Southern California, we had the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, who was led by John Griggs, a very interesting character. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love were basically some young guys living in Southern California who were hoods. They're the equivalent of hood rats, and they were rough, and they wrestled and surfed, and they were kind of the they were all American, but they were on the how shall we say this, the unpolished side of all American, and so they wanted to take some LSD, and they'd heard about it since they were smoking grass from Mexico, things like that, crappy hash, and they decided to. There was a guy who was an academic. He lived up in the L.A. hills, and apparently he had large quantities of LSD, and he was selling the hits for about $65 a piece. It was quite expensive because it was quite rare. How he got this stuff was probably through Leary and the university network. Anyway, they went up to his house and they robbed him of LSD. They stole all the acid, and then they took the acid, and it changed their lives, and they became yet another major force for this thing called the 1960s. What's really interesting is that I was watching these two documentaries intently, and I realized that I lived in two of the places where the majority of this LSD was pumped out for quite a while. I did not live in Windsor, California, which is where Nick Sand and Tim Scully had their lab, but I did live in Point Richmond, which is where Owsley was pumping out his LSD, and I did live in Laguna Beach when I was 9 years old. This is 1969. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love is hanging around Laguna Beach in 1969. And I was a kid, and I was there, and I remember the thick hippie vibe of growing up in Laguna Beach, albeit for a few months. It was everywhere. It was ubiquitous. So, and I lived in La Honda, which is where Ken Kesey did his thing. So I've lived in these three places. It's almost like I've been making this acid pilgrimage in some ways. And I have to tell you, in a moment of candor and honesty here, that lysergic acid diethylamide 25 played a huge role in my life. I mean, I had the same kind of fervor when I was in high school, and I was like, man, this is it, man. If we can just get there, if we could all just get to this place, we could solve a lot of problems. And over time, and Sand hadn't done any LSD in 25 years. He was just recently, the last 14. I guess he was at a conference about 14 months ago, and they asked him, would you like to do some LSD? And he said, no, I haven't done any in 25 years. And I don't think you have to do it as a constant sort of rite that connects you into the central sun, the great central sun. But there is something to be said for having contact with that force. And I think we're missing it today. in our world. I think we're really missing it. And it's been replaced by sort of this, I don't know, this mutagenic cannabis that is way more powerful than anything anybody else experienced back in like the 60s and the 70s, and the bath salts, and it's been completely replaced. So we don't have a true psychedelic relationship with reality anymore, and it probably would be a good thing. And if we could combine the psychedelic consciousness with the discovery and the unfoldment of what's happening at a core political level, at a matrix style level, it could be real interesting and very potent. And that's the 1-2 punch. And that sets us up for greater awareness, greater love, greater creativity. And at the same time, if we can pair it with a new technology, which is discernment, boy, we could really change a few things here. Anyway, it's just a thought and a bit of a meditation. And Nick Sand passed away. He passed away back on the last week of April. And he was a giant, and he was a giant to the end. And I heartily urge you to find these 2 documentaries on Nick Sand and Tim Scully, and then the other on the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which you can find both on Amazon. And I think they're also on YouTube. A lot of these documentaries that are on Amazon and Netflix show up on YouTube. So anyway, wherever you are, Nick Sand, I am sure you're enjoying the journey. And Kevin, brother, we wish you all the best and send you love and blessings in your time here in the third dimension, and take it all in, and keep doing your thing from the other side. So let's get into some other stuff. I'm going to try to bring in a different angle, kind of a unique angle today, or maybe it's just an angle that maybe is not so unique, but I wanted to talk about it anyway. There's this new guy who's running South Korea, and he's 64 years old. His name is Moon Jae Inn. Moon Jae Inn. And he's an interesting character because his predecessor was kicked out of South Korea because he was corrupt. There was corruption, and they kicked him out. And this guy Moon Jae-in, who's been around for a while, it's not like he's some guy they just picked up off the waiver wire. He's been around, and the first thing he did is he really kicked in and said, hey, I want to meet with Trump. I'll fly to Washington. I'll fly to China. I'll fly to North Korea. I'll meet Kim Jong-un. I mean, this guy has been very aggressive towards establishing some form of truce and peace in South and North Korea. And this is not necessarily what Trump and the generals, maybe the generals, I think Trump could go either way. Look, I think if all of a sudden there was unification in North and South, when I say unification, I don't mean the two countries coming together, that these guys have a handshake deal and they've got like interesting kinds of deals in place for trade and all that stuff, and sort of strengthening one another's ties while remaining in their own right sovereign. I think Trump would take credit for that. I think he would be fine with that. He would say, well, if it wasn't for us and, being there and our presence and, showing the South Koreans that we support them and showing the North Koreans that we don't have a lot of patience for them, that this wouldn't have happened. Of course, he would take credit for it because that's who Donald Trump is. So I don't think he really cares as long as there's some result that makes him look good. Now, his handlers and the puppet masters in other parts of the planet, well, they may care, and they may care a great deal because they want North Korea displaced. Now, maybe, perhaps, and I got to think 2, 3, 4 steps ahead here, maybe Mr. Moon is kind of a double, triple, quadruple agent, and he's set up to create this establishment of trust and hegemony, harmony, and as a result, then they go in and then they flip North Korea. He's almost like a Trojan horse in some ways. I mean, that's really, sort of the extreme version. But perhaps there's something else to him that is actually vital, true, sovereign, authentic, and real. So let's get into his chart just for a bit, because I thought it was interesting to look at. And he happens to be an Aquarius. He's born in 1953, which is, I believe, the year of the snake, because the moon here is in Taurus, which means it's gone past the new moon in Aquarius. So he's a fresh snake. He's a young snake. And he's got Chiron and Mercury in Capricorn, which means he can deal with and handle, the institutions and the oligarchs to some degree. To some degree. He has that sun in Aquarius, and he has true node in Aquarius. So he's here for Aquarian expression, Aquarian values. And Aquarius generally tends to, round up to the next level, which is group consciousness, and some form of social harmony. Not without some degree of radicalization at times. The most paradoxical sign, I believe, in the zodiac, which is Aquarius. But he also has his Venus and Mars in Pisces. And they're conjunct, and they're very close together. And to me, this combination of Venus and Mars is harmony, because he's trying to bring Venus, which is peace, together with Mars, which is aggression and action. And it's Pisces, so there's this form of higher consciousness that's associated with it. And this blending. And Venus and Mars in his chart, they're not necessarily afflicted. The one thing that they have is that Venus has an inconjunct with Pluto. And when we get into the inconjunct, we get into the hidden meaning between the two planets. So there could be potentially some perhaps more powerful and Plutonian force tugging at him in ways that other people can't see, or maybe even he can't see. But on the surface, his Venus and Mars are actually in a very interesting place inside the chart. Not only that, but he has a Taurus moon, which is generally peaceful, right? And he has Jupiter in Taurus, again, ruled by Venus, more peace. And that Mars-Venus conjunction is in trine with the moon in Taurus. So this guy is actually a bit of a peace lover. He does not have a lot of fire in his chart. So he does not have a lot of fire in the belly. He's got one fire planet, that's Pluto. And then he has Uranus in Cancer. And guess what? Mars and Venus are in a trine with Uranus in Cancer. And Jupiter is in sextile with Uranus. So we're talking emotion. We're talking kind of a different, sort of take on how to process and channel that emotion. He's an interesting character. Now, he also has some hard squares going on. He's got a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which isn't a deal breaker. If you can bring compassion to Saturn, or you can bring structure and form to the free-floating consciousness of Neptune, then it can work. But it's also in square with the sun. And so his idealism might be met with disillusionment with the Saturnian forces that basically rule the planet. So keep an eye on this guy. He's got an interesting chart, and he has certainly become quickly kind of a wild card in play. How long he lasts, will he flip? He doesn't necessarily have the flip tendencies of Trump. He's got his sun is in a fixed sign. He's got Jupiter, Moon, and Taurus, which are fixed. He's got Pluto and Leo. So he has a lot of fixed planets in his chart. And keep your eye on what's happening in Korea with Mr. Moon basically coming to our attention really on the night of the Scorpio full moon. One of the other things I wanted to get into today before we talk about sort of where we are is I wanted to just briefly touch on health. As we're talking about psychic health and perhaps the health of a region. The health of the Pacific Northwest is certainly under the microscope with what's happening at the Hanford power plant up in Washington. Apparently they've had a major collapse in some of the tunnels there that are connected to storing the spent rods and fuel and dirty water, whatever it is that they store up in Hanford. There's been a collapse in these tunnels, and they're not talking about it, but there could have been a breach in that storage, and so that waste would leak out into the Columbia River, which is, I mean, having these nuclear power plants, and I get it, right? I understand why they're near water so they can cool them down. Yeah, I totally get it. But it's like when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. It gets into the water supply, whether it's the Pacific Ocean, whether it's the Gulf of Mexico, or whether it's the Columbia River. And then the next thing you know, there's downstream, there's toxicity. And now there are some people who believe that there's nothing toxic about radiation. And Jay Widener's been on my show and he's talked about it. I don't know. Prove it to me. I'd rather err on the side of caution. Let's put it that way. So we've got the problem up in Hanford, and we'll have to keep an eye on that. And we'll have to keep an eye on it ourselves because mainstream media is not going to talk about it. One of the things I wanted to share with you before we take off today is I'm going to cross this article, and we've talked about this before on the show. This is from February, and it has to do with the real reason wheat is toxic. And it's not the gluten. I gave up eating wheat it was around 2011, so about 6 years ago. Off and on, I'll have a little tiny taste. Like if I'm at dinner, my son's got an incredibly seductive dessert, I'll have a bite or two, and maybe three, but that's about it. Or maybe if there's a really, really amazing loaf of bread at dinner and some olive oil stuff, I might take, a quarter of that piece of bread just so I can taste it. But by and large, it's all been eradicated from my diet, including beer, which has a ton of wheat. So many of you know that the reason why people are getting sick with wheat is, number one, it's hybridized, and number two, they spray glyphosate on the wheat and the barley as a desiccant. And apparently this goes back to like as early as 1980. So they were playing around with it in 1980. And over the past 15 years, it's been really ramped up. And it's used as a drying agent. They do this about 7 to 10 days before the harvest. So this is what Steven Seneff of MIT, who studied the issue in depth, he says that when you expose wheat to a toxic chemical like glyphosate, it actually releases more seeds, resulting in a slightly greater yield. It goes to seed as it dies. At its last gasp, it releases the seed. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as of 2012, 99% of durum wheat, 97% of spring wheat, and 61% of winter wheat has been treated with herbicides. This is an increase from 88% for durum wheat, 91% for spring wheat, and 47% for winter wheat since 1998. Wheat farmer Keith Lewis chimes in. This is what he has to say. He says, I've been a wheat farmer for 50 years. And one wheat production practice that is very common is applying the herbicide Roundup, glyphosate, just prior to harvest. Roundup is licensed for pre-harvest and weed control. Monsanto, the manufacturer of Roundup, claims that application to plants at over 30% kernel moisture result in Roundup uptake by the plant into the kernels. Farmers like this practice because Roundup kills the wheat plant, allowing an earlier harvest. A wheat field often accelerates. It's an accelerant. Okay, it's an accelerant, and then it helps it dry out. A wheat field often ripens unevenly, thus applying Roundup pre-harvest evens up the greener parts of the field with the more mature. So what happens is if there is parts of the wheat harvest that are lagging, Roundup kicks it in. Roundup's like if you add nitrous oxide to an engine, you probably get about another 20 to 25 miles per hour out of that engine, maybe more. This is what Roundup does to the wheat harvest. The result is on the less mature areas, Roundup is translocated into the kernels and eventually harvested as such. Here's what's interesting. This practice is not licensed. Farmers mistakenly call it desiccation. Consumers eating products made from wheat flour are undoubtedly consuming minute amounts of Roundup. An interesting aside, malt barley, which is made into beer, is not acceptable in the marketplace if it has been sprayed with pre-harvest Roundup. Lentils and peas are not accepted in the marketplace if it was sprayed with pre-harvest Roundup. But wheat is okay. This farming practice greatly concerns me, and it should further concern consumers of wheat products. And then Seth Woodland of Woodland and Wheat from Idaho, this is what he has to say. He's a wheat farmer. That practice is bad. I have fellow farmers around me that do it, and it is sad. Lucky for you, not all of us farm that way. I'm sure he's getting some downdraft, though. And also downstream in the water. Being the farmer and also the president of a business, we are proud to say we do not use Roundup on our wheat, ever. Well, that's good. That's good, but unfortunately people around you do. So it's not just widespread in the U.S. either. They do it in the UK, other European countries. They're waking up to the dangers of it. In the Netherlands, the use of Roundup is completely banned, and apparently France is going to follow shortly, but that remains to be seen with Mr. 66.6% of the vote background. So the whole idea here is to get us off of this glyphosate and get us back to, real wheat, healthy wheat that has not been hybridized. And we know it comes along with some of the consequences of glyphosate. And if you have not seen some of the disorders that come out of this, let me just read them to you. Gastrointestinal disorders, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, depression, autism, infertility, cancer, MS, Alzheimer's. The list goes on and on and on. And we don't know how this stuff is interacting with what's in our water, what's in the chemtrails. I mean, we're in a really, we're out in space, literally with our bodies, and there's very little that we can relate to or connect with from an earlier time where we were organic and analog beings. We're being genetically and chemically manipulated. And you've got to wonder why we're having a rash of, and look, I'm out on a limb here, but I think it could make an interesting case that transgenderism might be connected to a whole array of issues, because we have a huge uptick in this, not just from the fact that we're being saturated with it inside the media, but our chromosomes, our genes, our bodies are changing. And they're changing at an alarming rate, and the species is changing at an alarming rate as well. So the healthy home economist goes on to say you must avoid toxic wheat no matter what. And I totally agree with this. So if you want to eat wheat safely, this is what she recommends. She says that we source organic, naturally low in gluten, unhybridized einkorn wheat. And they make everything at home. So if you want wheat, you want bread, unhybridized einkorn wheat for bread making, pancakes, cookies. And she says, please note that einkorn is not to be confused with the more general term farro, which includes emmer and spelt, which are both hybridized. So she's trying to get away from the hybridized species of grains. You can learn more about the scientific research on the good gluten in einkorn in this article. It's a link. I don't have that link. So, if you want to try to get a handle on your health, I quickly go back to this whole piece around wheat and gluten, and to find alternatives and even avoid it completely, and even avoid some of the gluten-free stuff, which apparently is high in aluminum. And boy, that's what we need in our environment, more aluminum. All right, I wanted to just briefly touch upon sort of this, the roundup of the show, rounding up the show. Hey, redeeming roundup. And I've been thinking a lot about this whole psychedelic revolution, which took place in the 1960s, and kind of marrying it with this consciousness where we're uncovering the truth. Right? Now, what they had in the 60s, and I thought it was really interesting that the Brotherhood of Eternal Love created Orange Sunshine. These are people that were Pluto and Leo people, and their biggest brand of LSD was Orange Sunshine and their Pluto and Leo-ness. But they got love. They got the love thing down, right? What they didn't necessarily, to some degree, they did. I mean, they knew sort of who, there was some very interesting kind of consciousness around conspiracy in some ways back in the '60s, but it was not. It was a consciousness that was sort of, how do I say this, managed. It was managed. It was just like how the AstroTurf, the Patriot movement, or the AstroTurf, the Tea Party, they were AstroTurfing the '60s because the conspiracy model was essentially cordoned off for the United States government and people like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, which to some degree I think was probably not bad, but it wasn't like really getting to the core. I mean, they would get into Nixon, but they wouldn't get into Kissinger per se. They would get into maybe part of the military-industrial complex, maybe Bobby McNamara, but they wouldn't get into JFK, and that was still very fresh and very traumatic. But they didn't get into it, and they didn't get into LBJ, and they didn't get into the Great Society, and they didn't get into the war on poverty, because that is really where everything begins to tilt on its axis. And they thought that many of the baby boomers were kind of at the elbow with the beginning of social Marxism and Marcuse and a lot of the sort of French deconstructionists and socialist thinkers that were being introduced to American colleges at that time. So as a result of that, they cordoned off the whole conspiracy around communism, Bolshevism, the bankers, the connection to the Rothschilds. So there was almost like it was a controlled demolition in some ways. So what would happen if we had that same kind of consciousness, that same kind of love that they nailed? And I think they did, and I think we got to give them their due. And I know the baby boomers take a lot of shit, and the millennials don't like them because they have that Pluto square going on between the two of them. But the truth part was mitigated. It was given to them in a way that they could handle it, and it was manageable at that point. So if we could take that that love piece, and bring it forward into the truth piece, wow! Now here we go. Now we're hitting on all 8 cylinders. And the other thing that I think we have to begin to rethink here is, I think, and sometimes I am as guilty of this as other people in this space. I think we have to take the heat off the end of the world, because you can't, and we can't live like that on a daily basis. It's just not healthy. Now, understanding what's going on and calmly and coolly dissecting the events of the day and understanding sort of the different levels of the matrix to the best of our ability, I think, is essential. But we can't get held up in fear and, feeling as if, every day is going to be the, sort of the consummation of our experience. They went through this in the 60s. They went through it in the 50s. They had the Cold War. Kids hid under their desks. This is nothing new. It's a very similar psychological tactic. So we stay on our toes, but we have got to start living. And if you're not living, you better get going. And that means that you engage in everything really fully, right? You engage in the acquisition of resources. You engage in the building of relationships. You engage in less isolation and more community. You engage in the right to govern your mind, your sovereign experience, and that's all part of it too. So we've got to stake our claim into this world, and not look towards something like the ascension or the rapture or whatever off-world fantasy we have is. And we also have to take a really kind of clear look at what goes on with these conflicts in the world. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Are we living in utopia? Absolutely not. Hell no. There are real problems and issues. But Armageddon may not be one of them tomorrow, or maybe even next week or next month. So let's live like it isn't. All right, this is Robert Phoenix, and you've been listening to 15 Minutes of Flame. I'll be back tomorrow with the Friday Forecast. Who knows where we'll go with that. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to step into what's possible. Have a great day.